He was laughing when the envelope arrived. That's the part that never leaves you, not the betrayal itself, but the fact that he was laughing. Champagne in hand, Celine's perfume soaked into the collar of a shirt that cost more than most people's rent. And Darius Vane was laughing at something. She said, while his pregnant wife sat alone in a nursery with unfinished walls, placing her wedding ring inside an envelope. The courier didn't even knock. Twice, Darius tore it open, the way he opened everything like it owed him something. And then the laughter stopped. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel like the last thing on their list, stay with me. Because this story isn't just about a man who lost everything. It's about what a man has to become before the people he destroyed can even consider letting him back in. If this story already has you feeling something, hit that subscribe button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. The morning it all broke open, Darius Vane was not at home. He hadn't been home in 11 days, though he would not have been able to tell you that without checking his phone. Time worked differently when you were the kind of man Darius had become, not measured in days or meals or conversations, but in deals closed, threats neutralized, and territory held. Yup, 11 days meant nothing to a man who had spent the last 3 years building something so enormous it had swallowed him whole, without him ever noticing the teeth. He was at the penthouse on the 42nd floor of a building his corporation owned outright, the one with the east-facing windows that turned Manhattan gold every morning. And Celine was sitting across from him at the kitchen island, in a silk robe that was not hers, eating a piece of fruit with the studied casualness of a woman who had decided she belonged somewhere she hadn't been invited. Darius didn't notice. That was the honest truth of it. He genuinely didn't notice, because Celine had been orbiting him so long and so smoothly that her presence had stopped registering as a choice. She was just there, the way his driver was just there, the way his security detail was just there. Efficient, available, asking nothing of him that he couldn't deliver with half his attention. He was reading from a tablet, reviewing the numbers from a private port transaction that had closed at 3 in the morning, when the buzzer from the lobby sounded. Expecting someone? Celine asked. Always expecting someone. The courier was young, maybe 22, wearing a company uniform that meant nothing, and carrying a sealed envelope that meant everything. Darius signed for it the way he signed for everything, quick, unbothered, already looking back at his tab before the kid had fully turned away. The envelope was thick. That was the first thing that registered. Not heavy in the way of documents or financial filings, but thick in the way of something personal, the way a letter feels when someone took time with it. He set it on the counter and kept reading his numbers for another 30 seconds before something pulled his hand back toward it. No return address. His name in Nia's handwriting. He knew her handwriting the way you know the sound of a door in your own house. Not because he spent time studying it, but because it had been in the background of his life for 6 years, and the body remembers what the mind ignores. He opened it. He was careful, actually. That detail mattered to him later, in the long sleepless months that followed. He was careful with the envelope, as if something in him already understood that whatever was inside deserved more than the casual violence he applied to everything else. He didn't tear it. He worked the seal open with one finger. 3 things fell onto the white marble counter. The first was a photograph, black and white, the kind they print during ultrasounds. A profile, a small curled shape, a perfect thumb visible against a tiny cheek. At the bottom, written in the technician shorthand, 32 weeks. Male, healthy. The second was his wedding ring. The one Nia had placed on his sister herself, in front of 200 people on the best afternoon of his life, 6 years ago, when he still believed he could be the man she saw when she looked at him. The third was a single sheet of paper, folded once. Her handwriting, steady and unhurried. Darius, her son, is healthy. The doctor says he's strong. He has been moving a lot at night, which is when I'm most alone. So in a strange way, I've gotten used to his company. I waited for you to come back, not to the penthouse, to us. I waited longer than most women would have, and I want you to know that I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I just say it because it's true. I can't do this to him. I refuse to let him spend his first years watching his mother stand at a window waiting for a car that isn't coming. The papers are from my attorney. Please don't look for me. If you want to know your son someday, become someone worth knowing. Darius read it twice. Then he read it a third time, and that was when his hands started to shake, not violently, not in the way of a man losing control, but in the quiet, terrible way of a man who has just understood something irreversible. What is it? Celine asked, and the sound of her voice in that moment, bright, curious, leaning slightly forward on her elbows, did something to the air in the room that Darius spent a long time trying to describe. It wasn't that she'd done anything wrong. It wasn't even that her presence was offensive. It was that the sound of her voice made the weight of the ring on the counter suddenly enormous, and the ultrasound photograph suddenly unbearable, and the entire 42nd floor suddenly feel like a stage set that had never been real. He picked up his keys. Darius, don't. He said it quietly. Not angry, not cold, just done. The way a door sounds when it finally closes and the latch catches. He drove to the estate himself. No driver. He didn't even call ahead. He told himself it was because there was nothing to arrange. But the real reason was that he needed those 40 minutes on the bridge and the highway and the long private road through the iron gates to be alone with what he'd read, because some things shouldn't have a witness. The gates opened on the sensor. He parked in the roundabout. He sat in the car for 4 minutes before he could make himself go inside. The house was quiet, in a way that houses are only quiet when they have been emptied deliberately, not the quiet of sleeping or absence, but the quiet of intent. The kind of silence that has been arranged. Her closet, the hangers were there. The clothes were not. The reading chair by the bedroom window, the small stack of books she kept there, was gone. The indent in the cushion was still shaped like her. The bathroom, her creams, her oils, the specific brand of unscented soap she'd used since before he met her gone. His stuff remained, which somehow made it worse. His things were exactly where they'd always been, unchanged, undisturbed, as if even in leaving, she had been careful not to disturb the things that belonged to him. He walked to the end of the hall. The nurse's door was open. He stood in the doorway and looked at it for a long time without going in. The walls were painted a soft gray blue, the color Nia had chosen from 17 different Swiss couches spread across the dining room table, while Darius was on a call in another room, promising someone something he couldn't actually deliver. The ceiling had been decorated with stars, tiny gold stars, the kind that glow faintly in the dark. She had done that herself, apparently. He learned that later, from the housekeeper. Nia had climbed a stepladder at 30 weeks pregnant and stuck each star in place by hand because she wanted them arranged in real constellations. He hadn't known that. He hadn't been there. The crib was still in its box against the wall, unassembled. The rocking chair in the corner had a small envelope on its cushion. He crossed the room and picked it up. Inside was a folded piece of paper, a list, written in the same steady handwriting. Things we were supposed to do before he arrives. Build the crib together. Attend the Tuesday parenting class. Bring snacks. Darius hates the parking. Pick a lullaby, something we can both actually remember at 3 a.m. Take the first family photograph. Finish the nursery ceiling. 12 stars still need to go up. Not one item had been crossed off. Darius sat down in the rocking chair, and he held that list, and he did not move for a very long time. He was not a man who cried easily. He had built himself, deliberately and methodically, into someone who processed emotion through action. A threat became a plan. A loss became a lesson. A wound became leverage. Crying was something he associated with powerlessness, and powerlessness was something he had spent 20 years engineering himself out of. But sitting in that rocking chair, in the room he should have helped paint, beside the crib he should have built, beneath stars he hadn't known were shaped like real constellations. Darius Vane felt something happen behind his sternum that he did not have a word for. Not grief, exactly. More like recognition. The sick, delayed recognition of a man who has just realized the damage he caused was not a side effect of his choices, but the direct result of them. He had not been stolen from his family. He had walked away. Again and again and again, in 1,000 small decisions, that each seemed reasonable in isolation. He had chosen the Empire over the woman carrying his son. And she had documented every single absence in a little green journal that he found tucked behind the rocking chair cushion like she'd left it there on purpose. He almost didn't open it. He almost put it back without reading a word. There is a kind of self-preservation that kicks in. When you know the truth is going to be ugly and you've spent a lifetime not looking at ugly truths directly. He opened it. The early pages were what he expected and could not fully absorb her excitement in the first weeks. The way she described the first positive test, the morning she'd called him, and he hadn't answered because he was in a meeting with 3 men who were renegotiating the terms of something that now seemed completely abstract. He'd called her back 4 hours later. He remembered that call. He remembered being distracted while she talked. He had not understood what she was trying to tell him. Then the entry shifted. Not dramatically, Nia was not a dramatic woman. She didn't scream on the page or fill it with accusations. What she did, which was somehow worse, was report. 22 weeks. Appointment at 9. Dr. Ferris says everything is perfect. The nurse asked where Darius was, and I said he had an emergency with work. She nodded like she's heard that before. 26 weeks. He promised he'd come to the anatomy scan. I got there early, saved the chair beside me. Kept my phone on the table in case he texted. He sent a voice message at 1 p.m. Something came up. I'll make the next one. I smiled at the technician, and she printed me extra pictures. 28 weeks. I've started going to the prenatal yoga class on Thursday mornings. There's a woman there named Deborah who comes alone too, but hers is because her husband passed last year. When she found out I was alone for a different reason, she didn't say anything. Just moved her mat closer to mine. 30 weeks. I stopped telling the nurses he was running late. I just go in. Darius set the journal down. He picked it up again. 32 weeks. I finished packing the hospital bag. His was in there too, just in case. I don't know why I packed it. I think I'm still hoping. 33 weeks. He called tonight from somewhere loud. I could hear Celine laughing in the background. He said he'd be home by the weekend. I said okay. I don't think either of us believed it. 34 weeks. I took the nursery list off the wall tonight. I'm going to keep it somewhere. Maybe someday it'll mean something different. This is the last entry I'm going to write here. Not because things are resolved, but because I finally understand that waiting for him to come back is its own kind of decision, and I'm choosing differently now. Our son deserves a mother who isn't diminished, so I'm going to go be that. Whatever comes next, this part is finished. Darius sat in the rocking chair until the light changed through the window, and the room went from gray-blue to deep shadow. He didn't turn on a lamp. He sat in the dark with the journal and the list and the unassembled crib and the scene full of stars. His wife had put up alone at 30 weeks pregnant, and he let the silence of the house tell him the truth his ego had been filtering out for 3 years. He had not lost his wife the way men lose things carelessly, accidentally, in a moment of weakness. He had given her away, one canceled appointment at a time, one unanswered call at a time, one dinner cut short, and one weekend postponed, and one promise until it broke. He had given her away slowly, deliberately, in favor of an empire that would not notice his absence, while she sat in a nursery surrounded by unfinished stars and documented every single time he didn't show up. He tried to find her. Of course he did. Within 48 hours, he had 3 separate teams working the problem, the kind of men who could locate anyone, who understood how data moved and where it hid, who had found people who did not want to be found in 15 countries across 4 continents. They found nothing. No hotel under her name or any variation of it. No credit card activity after a withdrawal she'd made 6 weeks earlier cash, a substantial amount, clearly planned. No flight records, no car rental, no digital footprint at all after the morning she'd left. It was as if Nia Caldwell Vane had studied exactly what her husband could track and then built her exit around every single one of his capabilities. She had known him, she had understood him completely, and she had used that understanding to disappear in a way that left him no leverage and no pursuit. The men he sent came back to him, one by one, over the following 2 weeks, with the same expression the expression of professionals who are uncomfortable reporting failure, but who also genuinely cannot explain it. She's not in the system, one of them told him. Not anywhere we can reach. Darius looked at him for a long moment. She's a 33-year-old woman with a baby due in 6 weeks. She's somewhere. Yes, sir. Just not somewhere we can find. He sent them back. They came back again with nothing. And in the space that failure created, other things began to surface. His lieutenants were moving differently around him, quieter, more careful, reading him for vulnerability, the way men in his world always read vulnerability. Because in his world, vulnerability was an opportunity. An opportunity was never ignored. Celine kept appearing at the edges of his professional life, with the practiced subtlety of a woman who knows when to press and when to simply be visible, and each time he looked at her now, he saw the background noise of his marriage last years, given a face and a name. He cut their personal relationship in a single conversation that lasted less than 4 minutes. She took it well. Women like Celine always took these things well on the surface. They had contingency plans. Darius spent 3 weeks in the mansion, going through everything Guy had left behind, and she had left very little, which told him something about how long she'd been planning until he found, tucked inside a pregnancy book on the shelf above where the baby's books would have gone, a postcard. Old. The kind with a photograph on the front, a small coastal town, weathered docks, boats at anchor, early morning light. On the back, a brief message from someone named Adele, dated 8 months earlier. Naya, the cottage, is empty all spring if you need somewhere quiet. You always loved it here. You know where the key is. The postmark read, Greyhaven. He had never heard of it. He found it on a map. A small coastal town, several hundred miles away, the kind of place that barely registered on regional tourism sites. Population just under 4,000. Known for its fishing boats and its Saturday farmers market and a community center that ran programs for new mothers. Darius drove there alone. No security, no advance team. No armor. Just himself and his car and the particular terror of a man who knows he is about to see something that will confirm the exact size of what he has lost. He had no plan. He had never operated without a plan in his adult life, and the absence of one made him feel stripped and strange. He drove into Greyhaven on a Tuesday evening, when the light was going sideways across the water, and the docks smelled like salt and cold, and something that reminded him, absurdly, of a childhood visit to the shore, so far back it barely existed as memory. The town was everything the postcard had suggested. Quiet, intact, the kind of place that had not been improved, which meant it had also not been ruined. He drove slowly through streets where children rode bicycles and a bakery had its lights on past closing, and 2 old men sat outside a hardware store doing absolutely nothing except existing in the evening air. He went to the community center the following morning. Inside, a volunteer was updating a bulletin board upcoming events, prenatal resource sheets, a photograph wall of recent program participants. The photographs were arranged by season. In the autumn section, third from the left in the second row, was a woman laughing at something off camera, her hand resting on a stomach that was very large and very round. Her natural curls catching the light, her brown skin warm against a yellow sweater. Nia, alive, present, laughing in a way he hadn't seen in so long he had forgotten the exact shape of it. He stood in front of that photograph for a long time. The volunteer eventually noticed him. An older woman with reading glasses, pushed up on her forehead, the kind of woman who has developed an accurate sensor for men who shouldn't be trusted and men who are simply carrying something heavy. She studied him for a moment. Then, you knew her? I know her. He corrected it immediately. Present tense. The woman was quiet for a beat. She came here looking for somewhere peaceful. She found it. She started helping other women in the program, even while she was still figuring out her own life. She paused, then added, gently, as if she already understood the fullness of what she was about to say. Her son was born here. In the spring, the floor did not shift. The lights did not change. Nothing in the community center moved at all. But something in Darius's chest did something that did not have a proper name. A son born here without him. He's almost 3 now, the woman added, and she said it looking directly at him, without cruelty but without apology, the way some women can deliver truth, straight and clear, and without the performance of softness it doesn't actually require. Darius nodded once. He didn't trust himself to say anything that would be worth saying. He was at the door when the woman spoke again. She still comes on Saturday mornings sometimes. The farmer's market, she loves the bread from the place, with the blue awning. He turned. She met his eyes. Tomorrow's Saturday, she said. And that was all. Darius went to the motel off the main road, the cheapest one in town, because something in him felt that luxury was wrong for this particular night, that he had no right to the things that had always insulated him from discomfort. He paid cash. He sat on the edge of the bed in a room that smelled like industrial soap, and he did not sleep. And through the window, the rain came down, slow and steady, while somewhere in this small town a nearly 3-year-old boy slept, without knowing. His father was 12 minutes away. Darius sat with that through the whole long night. He sat with the fact that his son had been born without him, had taken his first breath without him, had said his first word without him, had turned 1 and then 2 without him, had learned to walk and had fallen and had gotten back up and had laughed at things that were only funny to very small children, and none of it had a single fingerprint of his anywhere in it. He had not been stolen from those moments. He had traded them. The rain kept coming down. Darius Vane, the man who ran one of the most powerful criminal networks on the eastern seaboard, who had sat across from dangerous men and made them flinch with a look, who had never in his adult life sat in a room and felt genuinely powerless, sat in a $12 motel chair and felt genuinely powerless. Because his son was 12 minutes away, and he had not earned the right to close that distance yet. And for the first time in a very long time, possibly for the first time ever, Darius did not look for a way to take what he wanted. He sat still, and he waited for morning. The alarm on his phone went off at 6:15, which was unnecessary because Darius had not slept. He'd been sitting in the same chair since midnight, the one by the window that faced the parking lot and the strip of road beyond it, and the dark that eventually, slowly, became gray and then became morning. 6. The rain had stopped, somewhere around 4. After that there was just the silence of a small town doing what small towns do, breathing quietly through the night, without the machinery and pressure of a city that never fully closes its eyes. He showered in a bathroom where the water pressure was inconsistent, and the towels were thin, and none of that registered as discomfort, because discomfort required attention, and every piece of his attention was somewhere else. He put on the same clothes he'd driven here in. He didn't have others. He hadn't packed for a stay, because he hadn't known. This was where he was going when he left Manhattan. And some part of him thought that was appropriate, that arriving unprepared was the honest way to arrive at something like this. He ate nothing. He drove to Harbor Park at 7:30, which was 90 minutes before the farmer's market opened, because he didn't know what else to do with himself. And the motel room had started to feel like a holding cell. The park was small and weathered in the way of places that are used. Rather than maintained, the benches had seen real weather. The dock planks were salt-bleached. The grass near the waterline grew in whatever direction it chose. Fishing boats moved slowly in the harbor. A man in orange waders was doing something to a rope. 2 women walked a dog along the path without speaking to each other, which suggested they were old enough friends that silence had become companionable rather than awkward. Darius found a bench that faced the main entrance to the market area and sat down. He looked like a man waiting for a bus, which was the most anonymous thing he'd looked like in years. The market opened slowly. Vendors with folding tables and canvas covers. Bread, vegetables, local honey in small jars. A woman selling hand-knit things from a wheeled cart. A man with a portable griddle making something that smelled like butter and apples. Families drifting in. Children running slightly ahead of adults and being called back. The ordinary, complicated texture of a Saturday morning in a place where people had chosen a certain kind of life. Darius watched all of it without seeing much of it. His hands were in his jacket pockets. He was not fidgeting, which was an achievement, because his body wanted to do something: pace, drive, make calls, apply pressure somewhere, and he was holding it still through an act of will that cost more than most things he'd done in recent years. The silver station wagon arrived at 9:12. He saw it before it parked. He recognized it in the peripheral way. You recognize something you've been anticipating, not by any specific feature, just by the fact that it is the thing you've been waiting for, and the body knows before the mind catches up. Naya got out of the driver's side. She was wearing a rust-colored jacket and dark jeans, and her hair was pulled up loosely, the way she used to wear it on weekend mornings when they were first together, and the world was still small enough to fit inside a shared apartment and a Sunday routine. She looked, and he worked to find an honest word for it, instead of the easy one she looked like herself. Not the version of herself that had been diminished by waiting. Something different. Something that had gone through something hard and come out the other side with its shape changed, but its density increased. She looked like a woman who had made a decision and lived inside it long enough for it to become who she's. Then the rear door opened. The boy jumped out the way small children do with his whole body. No hesitation, both feet hitting the ground simultaneously, a small wooden airplane clutched in one fist. He was wearing a blue jacket one size too big and sneakers with something that might have been a dinosaur on the side. His hair was close-cropped and neat. He said something to Nia that Darius couldn't hear from this distance, and Nia answered without looking up from locking the car, and the boy accepted her answer and immediately began moving the airplane through imaginary air currents above his head. Darius did not move. He was aware of his own breathing, in a way he was almost never aware of it, each inhale a deliberate mechanical event, each exhale a controlled release of pressure. His hands were clenched inside his pockets, without his having decided to clench them. The boy had Naya's smile. Even from this distance, even in motion, that was undeniable, the particular wideness of it, the way it arrived without a preamble, sudden and complete. But the set of the eyes, the angle of the jaw when the boy turned to look at something, and his face went briefly serious, that was Darius's face. Not a resemblance. His face transferred with the accuracy that biology sometimes achieves, and parents spend years quietly marveling at. His son was 3 years old, was flying a wooden airplane through a farmer's market on a Saturday morning, and had never once looked at the man sitting on that bench and understood what he was looking at. Darius stayed where he was. He watched Nia stop at the bread table, the blue awning, exactly as the volunteer had said. She talked to the vendor with the ease of someone who had done this many Saturdays in a row, the ease of a regular, of someone who belonged here. The boy orbited her at a short radius, occasionally checking back to confirm she was still there, the way very small children do, needing the anchor, but also needing the distance from it. He landed the airplane on the edge of the table. He picked up a small round loaf and handed it to Nisa and said something. She laughed. Darius watched his son make his wife laugh and felt something in him that had no clean name, a compound thing, equal parts devastation and a strange, terrible gratitude that she was laughing, that they were here, that they were intact, despite everything he had failed to be. The wooden airplane rolled off the bread table. It hit the cobblestone, bounced twice, and spun and came to rest against the foot of Darius's bench. He looked down at it, a small, careful thing not mass-produced. Hand-carved, actually, one wing slightly imperfect, the nose sanded smooth. Someone had made it. He picked it up. The boy arrived at a run, which was apparently the only speed available to him, and stopped just short of the bench, looking at the airplane in Darius's hand, with the focused interest of a child assessing a stranger who has something of his. "Here you go, Captain," Darius said. His voice came out steadier than he had any right to expect. The boy took the airplane, examined it briefly to confirm it had survived the journey, and then looked up at Darius with the particular directness of a child who has not yet learned to be subtle about looking at people. "Thanks, mister." "You're welcome." The boy turned the airplane over in his hands. Then, in the unhurried way of small children, who have not yet absorbed the social instinct to move on from a moment that interests them, "Do you know what kind it is?" Darius looked at the airplane. "A Spitfire," he said. He didn't actually know if that was right. He said it with authority, because saying things with authority was the reflex of 20 years, and it apparently survived intact into farmers' markets in small coastal towns. The boy considered this. "I call it the Blue Thunder." "That's a better name, I know." Nia had turned around. He could not see her face in the second before she saw him, because she was still turning, still in the motion of turning, and he could see her hand tighten slightly on the bread, and her eyes move from Micah to the bench, and then find him, and then… Stop, she stopped. Not her feet, she wasn't moving her feet. Everything else stopped. The slight movement of her breathing changed. Her face went through something he could see, but not fully read. It happened too fast, and it was too layered. Recognition, obviously. But under and around the recognition, something more complicated. Fear, maybe, or something adjacent to fear, the particular alarm of a person who has built a careful thing and is now watching a variable they'd eliminated reappear on its own. 3 years collapsed into 1 second, and it was visible on her face before she could arrange anything over it. Micah looked between them. "Mommy, who is he?" Nia walked over. She walked steadily, which Darius recognized as a significant act of will. She stopped a few feet away, and he stood up from the bench, and they looked at each other across a distance that was both very small and absolutely vast. She looked at him for a long time before she spoke. "Micah." She said it quietly, the name a signal and an anchor at once. Her hand found the boy's shoulder without her looking down. "This is your father." The word landed differently than Darius had expected. He hadn't known what he expected, but it wasn't the plainness of it, the way she said it without performance or bitterness, just as a fact, as an introduction. Micah looked up at Darius with the focused seriousness of a child processing new information that doesn't fit existing categories. "Why didn't you come before?" The question struck him in the sternum, the way a closed fist would. Darius crouched down. He put himself at the boy's eye level, which felt like the right thing to do, which felt like maybe the first right thing he'd done in a very long time. "Because I kept choosing things that couldn't love me back," he said. Micah looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means I was wrong about what mattered. And then it was very late, and I had to figure out if I could fix it." "Can you?" Darius looked up at Nia. She was watching him, with the expression of a woman who has learned not to give anything away too early, who has been wrong before about what she was seeing in this man's face, and is not prepared to make that mistake again. "I'll stay only if your mother says I can," Darius said. Micah seemed to accept this as a reasonable answer. He went back to the airplane. Nia said nothing for a moment. She watched the boy, and then she looked at Darius, and she said, in a voice that was low and controlled, and not unfriendly, but not warm, either the voice of someone who has done the work of becoming honest about what they feel, without the performance of what they used to feel. "How did you find us?" Not a question. A statement that required an answer. Postcard. From someone named Adele. It was inside a book. Nia closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, something in her face had shifted, not softened. Adjusted. Like a person who has accepted a thing they thought they had more time before they'd have to accept. "How long have you been here?" "Since yesterday." "Did you come with people?" "No." She looked at him the way you look at something you are trying to read, for structural damage, checking the load-bearing elements, not the surface. "What do you want, Darius?" "I don't know how to answer that," without it sounding like something say to get what I want. "So I'm not going to answer it today." That stopped her. She'd clearly prepared for the answer. She knew him capable of the version, him that arrived with a plan, and executed it with confidence, and made you feel like the reasonable thing was to agree. She hadn't prepared for the version of him that declined to. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay? I mean, it's not okay. None of this is okay. But you're here in Micah already." She stopped. "He already knows your name," I told him, when he started asking. Her voice did something at the end of that sentence that she controlled quickly. "I figured he deserved the truth, even if you weren't here for it." Darius had no answer for that either, so he didn't offer one. "I can't invite you in," Nia said. "I need you to understand that." "I understand. I don't mean to my house. I mean to anything." I can't just," she stopped, rearranged. "I'm not the same woman I was. I need you to know that from the beginning." "I know." "You don't know. You're seeing me in a farmer's market." "That's not knowing." Her voice had an edge to it now, not quite anger, but the thing that lives just under anger, the weariness of someone who has worked very hard for something and is being asked to let someone near it who previously broke things. You don't know what it cost to get here. You don't know what the first 6 months were like, or what Micah's birth was like. Without you weren't there, and knowing you weren't there isn't the same as knowing what it was like for me. You're right. Stop doing that. Doing what? Agreeing with everything. I know what you look like when you're managing someone. I've seen it for 6 years. She looked at him directly. I need you to push back, or argue, or say the wrong thing, so I know this is actually you and not a performance. Darius looked at her. I came here with no plan, he said. I slept in a $12 motel room, and I didn't sleep, and I sat on that bench for an hour and a half waiting, and I still don't know what I'm doing. I don't have a speech. I don't have a strategy. I have nothing. I'm coming to you with nothing because everything I had was the wrong thing, and I got rid of it. Nia studied him. You got rid of Celine. Yes, how? I ended it. Personally. Not through someone else. She was quiet for a moment. Micah had moved a short distance away and was narrating a flight path to himself, the airplane banking through elaborate maneuvers that only made sense in his own physics. I need you to understand something, Nia said. I have a life here. It's a real life. It took everything I had to build it, and I'm not going to let you walk into it and upset it because you've decided. It's time. I'm not asking to walk into it. Then what are you asking? I'm asking if you'll let me earn the right to ask for something later. She looked at him for a very long time. You can come back next Saturday, she said. The farmer's market. Same time, we'll be here. Okay. That's not a yes to anything else. I know. And if you don't show up, or if you show up with bodyguards, or if I find out you put anyone on us to watch us between now and then, that's the end. Permanent end. You understand what I mean by permanent? Yes. She picked up her bread. She called Micah's name. The boy came running, stopping beside her, and looking up at Darius with the uncompleted appraisal of a child who has not yet learned that some questions are rude. Will you be here next Saturday too? Micah asked. Darius looked at Nia. She gave him nothing. Yes, he said. I'll be here. Micah nodded, like this was filed under acceptable, and turned and walked beside his mother toward the next table. Darius stood at the bench and watched them go. He did not move until the station wagon was out of the parking area, because leaving first felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate, like it would be a small repetition of the pattern. Another version of him being the one who walks away while she stays and watches. He drove back to the motel. He sat on the edge of the bed. He called his attorney, a man Garrett, who had been handling Darius's legal architecture for 9 years, and who had a remarkable tolerance for unusual instructions. I need you to start putting together a framework for legitimate transition, Darius said. Silence on the line. Transition of what, specifically? Everything. More silence. Then carefully. Define everything. The network. The arrangement with the port. The 3 holding companies in Delaware. The contracts with Villanueva's people. All of it. Darius was looking at the ceiling of the motel room, which had a water stain shaped like nothing in particular. I want it gone. Clean. Whatever that takes. Darius. Garrett's voice had shifted into the register he used for conversations he needed to be very careful about. What you're describing is not a weekend project. What you're describing could take 18 months minimum, and the people involved are not going to. I know who they are. Then you know that walking away from this isn't something you announce. This is something you engineer carefully over a long time, and you have to manage the people who will see us as weakness or opportunity before they can. That's why I'm calling you now instead of in 6 months. Start the clock. Garrett was quiet for a moment. Is this about Nia? It's about my son. Where are you? Somewhere so small. I need a little more than that, Darius. You have my number. If something's on fire, call me. Otherwise, start building me a way out of this thing. A real one. He ended the call. He lay back on the bed without taking off his jacket, and he stared at the ceiling, and he thought about what Nia had said. You don't know what the first 6 months were like. He thought about that for a long time, tried to build it from the outside, from the pieces he had, the journal entries, the photograph at the community center. The way the volunteer had said, she came here looking for somewhere peaceful with the particular warmth of someone describing a woman who had earned the peace she found. Nia at 8 months pregnant, arriving alone in a town where no one knew her name. Checking into whatever she'd arranged the cottage, the one from the postcard, unpacking alone, setting up whatever she'd managed to bring, going to appointments alone, meeting Deborah from the yoga class maybe, attending the community center programs and eventually reversing direction and helping with them instead. Building a life from the resources she had, which were considerable, because Nia was a person of considerable interior resources, and he had spent years being too busy to fully appreciate that. The birth. He did not let himself stay on that image long, because it did things to his breathing. Micah born without him, named without him, growing without him. 3 years of a life so fully lived that by the time Darius arrived in this town, his son was already a complete person, a person with opinions about airplanes and their names. A person who moved through a farmer's market with his mother with the ease of a Saturday routine. A person who could, of a Saturday routine, a person who could look a stranger in the eye and ask the questions. Adults had been too polite or too scared to ask. Why didn't you come before? Darius put his forearm over his eyes. Back in Manhattan, things were already moving, in the way that things in his world always moved when he was absent. Too long the cellular activity of an organization that fed on certainty and could turn predatory very fast when certainty thinned. 2 of his lieutenants had been meeting without informing him, which was a signal he recognized. A man named Renford, who handled the northern operations, had made 3 calls to a rival organization's intermediary in the last 10 days. His security chief had sent a message, flagging 2 incidents that, separately, meant nothing and together meant someone was testing his perimeter. He knew all of this because his phone contained evidence of all of it, messages and reports from the people whose job it was to tell him things, and he had been reading them for 12 hours while sitting in this motel room while the rain came down and the morning came and his son bought bread with his mother 40 minutes away. He made 3 calls. The first was to his security chief, who received instructions about the perimeter that were clear and measured and communicated that Darius was paying attention and that certain interpretations of his absence would be incorrect. The second was to a man who handled internal discipline, a conversation he kept extremely short, containing essentially 1 sentence and 1 silence that communicated everything the sentence didn't. The third call he almost didn't make. Renford answered on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting for it. "You've been busy," Darius said. "I've been doing my job. With Salazar's people. That's not your job. Things have been uncertain. Let me clarify something for you," Darius said. And his voice had gone to the particular register he reserved for conversations where the other person had made a mistake that required them to understand the full scope of it. "Nothing about the situation has changed. My presence in a particular geography for a particular number of days is not an invitation to explore alternatives. Do you understand what I'm saying to you?" A silence. "Yes, say the rest of it. It won't happen again." "Correct." He ended the call. He sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. He was aware that he had just done what he always did. Applied the gap, reasserted control, and that he had done it from a motel room in Greyhaven, while his son slept somewhere in this town under a roof. He had never stood inside. He put the phone face down on the mattress. He did not sleep. In the morning, he drove into town and bought a coffee from the bakery with the blue awning, the same one where Nia had bought the bread, and he sat at one of the outdoor tables and drank it and watched the street and said nothing to anyone. And no one said anything to him. And for 30 minutes, he was simply a man drinking coffee in a small town while the morning organized itself around him. It was the most unremarkable 30 minutes he could remember having in years. He drove back to Manhattan that afternoon. He did not go to the penthouse. He went to the mansion because the penthouse belonged to a version of himself he was in the process of demolishing, and the mansion at least contained the nursery, which contained the rocking chair, which contained the particular silence of a room where things had gone wrong, but where the stars were still on the ceiling, and the list was still in his jacket pocket, and some things were wrong, in a way that still had a direction to move. His security detail was at the gate. They noted his return. They didn't comment on the absence, which was correct behavior, but he could read in the way they held themselves the awareness that something was different, that the man who had come back was not calibrated the same as the man who had left. He went to the study. He spread the papers. Garrett had sent preliminary thoughts on a legitimate transition, the bones of a structure that would take months to build and would cost him an enormous amount, both financially and in terms of the relationships he'd spent decades accumulating. He read through all of it. He signed the first document. Then his secure line rang, the one that rang when something was genuinely on fire, not operationally complex but structurally dangerous. He answered it and listened, and the voice on the other end told him that the power struggle he had been managing at a distance had escalated overnight into something that required his physical presence in a room in the city within the next 2 hours, or the fracture would be permanent. "Who initiated it?" he said. The voice told him. "Tell them I'll be there in 2 hours," he said. He was there in 90 minutes. The room was in the back of a building he owned through a company that owned a company, and the 4 men seated around the table had the look of men who had been in a room together long enough for the air to have become thin with unspoken things. One of them, a man named Carver, who had been with Darius's organization for 11 years, and who was smart in the sharp particular way of a man who always knew which alliances were worth holding, looked at Darius when he came through the door with the look of a man who has been waiting to see what version of the problem has arrived. "You were gone for 4 days without telling anyone where you were," Carver said. "No greeting. I'm telling you now that it won't happen again without appropriate communication." Darius sat. "Tell me exactly what happened, and then we'll resolve it." What followed was 2 hours of the kind of conversation that required complete focus, the kind that had defined his professional life for 15 years, reading the room, reading the gaps between what people said and what they meant, applying just enough weight in just the right place to stop a pendulum that had been set in motion by his absence. He resolved it. He drove back to the mansion at 11:30 at night and stood in the kitchen and ate something cold from the refrigerator without tasting it, and then went to the study and looked at the signed document on the desk. He thought about Micah's face when he crouched down, the directness of it, the total absence of performance in those eyes. "Can you fix it?" He picked up a pen. He signed the second document. He was back in Greyhaven the following Saturday. Same time. Same bench. Same jacket. The silver station wagon arrived at 9:14, 2 minutes later than the previous week, which he noted without meaning to, because the habit of precise observation was apparently unkillable. Micah came out of the rear door in a different jacket, green this time, and the wooden airplane was present again, which meant it was not a special occasion object, but a daily one, a companion, which told him something about the boy that felt important to know. Nia saw him the moment she cleared the car door. She didn't freeze this time. Her eyes found him and she held it for a moment, and then she nodded a small acknowledgement. Not warm, not cold. Present, that was enough. He stayed at a distance. He didn't approach. He sat on the bench and drank coffee he'd bought beforehand and watched the market with the peripheral awareness of a man who is maintaining non-threatening proximity, which was possibly the strangest application of surveillance skills he'd ever put to use. After 40 minutes, Micah's airplane took a trajectory toward his bench again. He wasn't sure it was accidental this time. He picked it up. "Blue Thunder is very active this morning," Darius said when the boy arrived. "She's on a mission." Micah took the airplane back. He looked at it. He looked at Darius. "You came back. I said I would." Micah seemed to process this. "My friend Logan's dad says stuff and then doesn't do it. That must be frustrating." "It's annoying," Micah corrected, with the specific precision of a child who has thought about the right word for something. "You're right. Annoying's better." Micah held the airplane out and looked at its wings. "Are you going to keep coming?" Darius looked across the market to where Nia was standing at the vegetable table, not looking at them, but not looking at them either, maintaining a middle distance with the posture of a woman listening for something while looking somewhere else. "Yes," Darius said, "every Saturday." "What if something happens?" "Then I'll tell you before it happens, not after." Micah thought about that. Then, okay. He walked back toward his mother with the airplane aloft. Nia said something to him when he arrived beside her. Then she looked over at Darius. She looked at him for 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then she turned back to the vegetables. But in those 3 or 4 seconds, something in her expression had moved. Not much. A millimeter. The particular adjustment of a person who has seen something they weren't expecting to see and has not yet decided what to do with it. The following Monday, back in Manhattan, Garrett called. "We have a problem," Garrett said. "We have several problems." "Which one?" "The Villanueva arrangement. They've become aware that you're making structural changes. I don't know how these documents are sealed, and the conversations have been private, but they know something is shifting, and Villanueva's people are not receiving this information well." "What does that mean, specifically?" "It means there are conversations happening about what it would mean if your network fragmented, about who would be positioned to absorb what. There are people looking at your situation as an opportunity, and they're not being particularly subtle about the looking." Darius was quiet for a moment. "How long before this becomes a direct action?" "That depends on how they read your resolve. Right now, they think you might be distracted. If they come to believe the distraction is permanent, tell them I want a meeting. Next week. Wednesday. You're going to meet with Villanueva. I'm going to meet with Villanueva, and I'm going to communicate the terms of the transition in a way that makes the alternative to accepting those terms extremely clear. And the terms are that I walk away clean, and everyone continues to operate within their existing boundaries, and nobody inherits anything they didn't already have. And if they don't accept that..." Darius looked out the window of the mansion study toward the iron gate at the end of the drive. "Then we'll have a different conversation." He did not sleep well that week. On Wednesday, he sat across from a man named Villanueva in a restaurant that had been cleared of other diners, and he laid out the terms in the flat, unbothered manner of someone who has thought through every branch of this particular tree and has an answer waiting at the end of each one. Villanueva listened. He was a careful listener, which was why he'd survived as long as he had. He asked 3 questions, each of which Darius answered without hesitation or negotiation. At the end, Villanueva looked at him and said, "You're really done." "I'm really done." People say that. People who say it while they still want the thing aren't done. Darius looked at him. "I don't want it anymore." Villanueva was quiet for a moment. He was reading him, the way everyone in this world read everyone else, looking for the performance underneath the words, the angle, the strategy disguised as sincerity. What he found, apparently, was something that didn't match his usual templates. "All right," Villanueva said. "All right, but if you come back..." "I won't," Darius said, "and I think you know I mean that. Because the version of me that would come back to this doesn't exist anymore. And the version of me sitting here is only useful to you as someone you don't have a problem with." Villanueva picked up his glass. He looked at Darius over the rim of it with the expression of a man who has seen a great many people make decisions they can't sustain, and who is reserving judgment about whether this one is among them. "We'll see," he said. Darius drove back to the mansion. He sat at the desk and looked at the stack of documents. Garrett had prepared 18 months of careful, unglamorous work that would cost him more money than he can count and would reduce him, in terms of the world he'd occupied for 2 decades, to an ordinary man with legitimate businesses and a modest position of influence. He thought about Micah asking if he was going to keep coming. He picked up the pen. But before he signed the 3rd document, his phone lit up with a message from a number he didn't recognize. He opened it. There were 3 photographs. The first was of the silver station wagon parked outside a building he recognized as a school or a daycare, small, wooden, with a yard. The second was of Nayat Mom walking toward the entrance of that building, Micah's hand in hers. The third was a close-up of Micah's face, taken from close enough that whoever took it had been standing within 10 feet of his son. Below the photographs, a single line of text, "You're distracted. That's a liability. Come back properly, or the people around you start paying for your choices." Darius stared at the phone. His hands had gone completely still. The photographs were time-stamped from 2 hours ago. Someone had been standing 10 feet from his son. He set the phone down on the desk with the particular controlled precision of a man managing something that, if it got out, would not be manageable at all. He breathed. He looked at the signed documents. He looked at the phone. He thought about every decision that had brought him to this specific moment, the empire, The distance, the damage. Nia alone at prenatal appointments, while he was in rooms with men like the one who had sent these photographs. He had tried to walk away cleanly. Now someone had made it very clear that there was no clean way out. And somewhere in Greyhaven, in a small house near the water, his son was home from school and probably flying that wooden airplane through whatever domestic physics the afternoon allowed, entirely unaware that the world his father had built was not finished with any of them yet. Darius picked up the phone. He called a number that answered without a greeting, in silence, waiting. "Find out who sent this," Darius said, all the way back. "I want the hand, not the message." Then he set the phone down and sat in the silence of the mansion for a long moment, staring at nothing. He had a choice to make, and he had approximately 12 hours before the window for making it correctly closed. The man he was trying to become would call Garrett. Legally, at distance, would manage it legally, with the patience of someone who had accepted that certain consequences of his former life would arrive on their own schedule regardless of what he wanted. The man he used to be would make 3 calls and have this resolved by morning in a way that left no ambiguity and no future messages with photographs of his son's face. He sat very still between those 2 versions of himself, and the clock kept moving. He made the wrong call first. That was the honest accounting of it, and Darius would sit with that honesty for a long time after. He made the wrong call first, and everything that followed was downstream of that one decision, not a catastrophic decision, not an evil one, but the reflexive decision of a man whose 20 years of survival instinct hit a threat before his newer, slower, more careful self could get in front of it. He called Marcus. Marcus was not on the payroll in any formal sense. He existed in the margins of Darius's world the way certain necessary things exist, unpapered, untracked, available. He had a particular set of capabilities and a particular understanding of discretion, and Darius had used him twice in the last decade, both times for problems that required resolution without documentation. The call lasted 40 seconds. Darius described the photographs. He described the number they'd come from. He said, "Find the origin and the person and report back. Nothing further, nothing active, just information." Then he set the phone down, and he sat in the dark of the study, and he understood, with the delayed clarity of a man who has just heard himself think out loud, that the call he had made was the call the old Darius would have made. That the man he was working to stop being had just picked up the phone, without permission, from the man he was working to become. He almost called Marcus back. Almost. But the photographs were still on his phone. Micah's face, close enough that the photographer's shadow might have fallen across the boy's sneakers. The parking lot of the school, the station wagon, Naya's hand on the door. He left the call alone. He drove to Greyhaven the next morning without telling anyone where he was going. Not Garrett, not his security chief. He took a different route and parked 2 blocks from Nia's street, which he had not previously located, but which had not been difficult to find once he'd committed to finding it a matter of which records to access and having the access to access them, both of which he still possessed regardless of what he was in the process of dismantling. He sat in the car. He was not going to knock on the door. He understood that knocking on the door would be the exact wrong move. It would alarm Nia. It would introduce chaos into whatever careful Saturday structures she'd built, and it would communicate the thing he least wanted to communicate, which was that he had been managing her location without her knowledge, which he had, which was a problem he'd decided to stop thinking about for the moment, because the more immediate problem was that someone with access to certain information had stood 10 feet from his son and wanted Darius to know about it. He watched the house for 20 minutes. It was a modest thing. White with a small porch. A bicycle near the door Micah's, training wheels still on. A window on the upper left with curtains the color of sea glass. A bird bath in the small yard that was occupied by nothing currently, but that clearly had visitors regularly, based on the scatter marks in the soil around the base. Naya's car was in the drive. He watched the window. He told himself he was assessing for threat perimeter. He was also just looking at the house where his son slept. After 20 minutes, he drove away. On the drive back, Marcus called. The number is a burner, Marcus said. Purchased in cash from a bodega in Midtown 6 weeks ago. Used only twice, once to receive a call, once to send to you last night. The call it received came from a landline registered to a property management company in Jersey. Shell company. Traced back 2 layers before it goes clean. Who owns the shell? Silence. The particular silence of a man who is deciding how much of what he knows to say. Marcus. The name at the 3rd layer is Renford. The room he was back at the mansion by now, standing in the study with his jacket still on, went very quiet in a specific way that Darius's rooms went quiet when he received information that reorganized other information. Renford, the man he'd called 2 weeks ago, the man who'd been talking to Salazar's intermediaries, the man who had confirmed, in a 4-sentence conversation, that he understood the terms of his continued relationship with Darius's organization. He didn't stop, Darius said. He paused, Marcus said. He was covering while he built something. The photographs weren't a threat from outside. They were from inside. Darius sat down, not in the desk chair. On the edge of the small couch against the wall that he almost never used, the one that had been chosen by a decorator years ago, and that he'd never had an opinion about one way or another. He sat on it now because his legs had decided they were done with the performance of standing. He found them, Darius said. He's been watching the situation for a while, from what I can piece together. Your absence from the city, your communication patterns, the documents going through Garrett's office, someone leaked from Garrett's office, by the way. That's how the transition planning got out. How long has Garrett's office been compromised? At least 3 weeks. 3 weeks. The signed documents, the preliminary frameworks, all of it. Renford had been watching the dismantling from the inside for 3 weeks and had responded by finding Nia and Micah and taking photographs 10 feet from his son's face. Not a threat, a demonstration. A demonstration that said, you are not the only one who knows where things are. What does Renford want? Darius said, though he already knew. I think he wants the transition to stop. I think he's read the situation as you going soft, and he wants to either bring you back in line or be positioned to absorb what you're leaving behind. The photographs were a message about leverage. He thought I'd receive photographs of my son and fold. He thought you'd receive photographs of your son and call someone like me, Marcus said. And you did so, that landed. Darius sat with it. I need you to stand down, Darius said, a pause. Say that again. Whatever you're thinking about doing with what you found. Stand down. Don't move on Renford. Don't make contact. Don't signal. Nothing. Darius, I'm not negotiating this. Stand down. He ended the call. He sat on the couch and he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, and he held them there for a long moment, pressing until the darkness behind his eyes got bright at the edges, and he could feel his kind. Because here was the problem, laid out in its full ugly geometry. Renford knew about Greyhaven. Renford had the address or was close enough to it that the difference was academic. Renford had access to a network that could move faster and with less restraint than anything Darius could direct, while simultaneously trying to exit the world that network lived in. If Darius moved against Renford through official channels, through Garrett, through legal architecture, through the slow machinery of legitimate process, Renford would have time to do something with what he knew. If Darius moved against Renford the other way, through Marcus and the capabilities that lived in the margins, he would be doing exactly the thing he was trying to stop doing. He would be using the Empire to protect the family while simultaneously trying to dismantle the Empire. Those two actions would cancel each other out, and he would be back where he started, or somewhere worse, somewhere where Renford was neutralized, but Darius had repurchased his continuation in the world he was trying to leave. And that continuation would come with obligations, and those obligations would have deadlines, and those deadlines would become the new reason he wasn't home. He thought about Nia saying, if you come back with bodyguards, that's the end. He thought about Micah asking, are you going to leave again? He thought about the list on the changing table, not one thing crossed off. He called Garrett. Garrett answered, and Darius said 3 sentences. There was a leak from inside the office. He needed to know who it was within 24 hours, and in the meantime, nothing further moved through official channels until it was closed. Then he drove back to Greyhaven. He knocked on the door. He had told himself he wouldn't do this. He had sat in the car down the street and decided, with some clarity, that knocking on the door was the wrong move. He'd driven most of the way back to Manhattan before he turned around, because the version of him that drove away and managed this from a distance was also the version of him that had driven away and managed everything from a distance for years, and that version had produced the specific disaster he was currently standing inside. He knocked. He heard movement inside, a small thumping that was probably Micah running toward the sound. Then Dia's voice, redirecting, and then her footsteps, and then the pause before the door opened that meant she'd looked through the peephole. The door opened. She was in a sweater and jeans, her hair loose, holding a dish towel. He had clearly arrived in the middle of something domestic and ordinary, and he was aware of how his presence on this porch registered against that ordinariness, the wrongness of it, the intrusion of it, the way his entire existence was structurally incompatible with the life visible behind her in the warmth of that hallway. Darius, not a greeting, a demand for explanation. "There's something I need to tell you," he said, "and I need to tell you now, today, before I have time to decide there's a better way to handle it." She looked at him. He watched her read his face, the way she'd always been able to read his face, better than anyone else, better than his lieutenants, better than his lieutenants, better than men who'd been in rooms with him for 15 years. She read it, and whatever she saw there changed something in her posture. "Micah," she called, without taking her eyes off Darius. "Can you watch your show in your room, baby?" The small sound of compliance from somewhere behind her. Footsteps upstairs. She stepped outside and pulled the door mostly closed behind her. "Tell me," he told her. He told her about the photographs. He laid it out plainly, no softening, no strategic sequencing, just the facts in the order they'd happened. The message, the 3 photographs, Micah's face, at close range. Marcus. What Marcus had found. Renford. The leak from Garrett's office. The timeline. He told her that someone inside his world had found them and had used that knowledge to try to pull him back. He told her that he had called Marcus first, which was the wrong call, and then he had told Marcus to stand down, and that was where it currently stood. He told her all of it without pausing for her reaction, because if he paused for her reaction, he might start managing it, and managing it was the wrong instinct. She listened. She did not interrupt. She held the dish towel and looked at him and listened to everything. And he could see the work she was doing, the internal accounting, the rapid processing of what this meant against what she'd built and where they'd gotten to, and what Saturday mornings now meant, and what all of it was worth if the world he was supposed to be leaving had already found the address of the house she'd worked so hard to make safe. When he finished, she didn't say anything for a long moment. "Then you tracked our address." "Yes. You told me you came here because of the postcard." "I did come because of the postcard. I found the address through other means after." "What other means?" he told her. She looked at him. She stopped. Started again. "You've been monitoring us." "Monitoring is the wrong word. I located the address." "I haven't had anyone watching. How do I know that?" "Because I'm telling you, Darius." She said his name with the particular weight of a woman who has been lied to in comfortable ways for a long time and has developed a comprehensive intolerance for even comfortable lies. "The reason I was able to disappear is because I knew exactly how you operate. And now you're standing on my porch telling me that you used those exact capabilities on me after I disappeared. And you want me to take your word for it that you stopped at the address. I know how it sounds. It sounds like you, not cruel. Just precise. It sounds exactly like you." "Yes," he said. "It does. Because I am still exactly me in a lot of ways that I'm working on. And one of those ways is that when I'm afraid for someone I care about, I gather information. And I did that. And I understand if that... Did you have anyone watching us?" "No." "Say it again." "No. I found the address. I drove here once to sit in the car and look at the house. That's the entirety of it." She looked at him for a long time with the expression of a woman running probability, calculating the likelihood that what she was hearing was true against the full history of who she was hearing it from. "You sat in your car outside my house?" "Yes." "And you didn't tell me?" "No." And now someone else has found us. And you're telling me today because you decided the honest approach was because Micah was 10 feet from someone who works for a man who is trying to use your safety to control me. That's why I'm here today. His voice came out harder than he meant it to. He managed it back down. I'm not here to make myself feel better about how I handled this. I'm here because you have the right to know that your safety has been compromised, and you have the right to make decisions about that. Nia's jaw had tightened. She looked away from him, toward the street, toward the birdbath in the yard, toward anywhere that wasn't his face for a moment. What are you going to do about it? She said. I don't know yet. That's not an answer. It's the honest answer. The two options I have both cost something I don't want to pay. She turned back to him. So, what you're telling me is that the world you're supposedly leaving has followed you here. And the way to fix it involves either going back to that world or doing nothing and hoping. It's more complicated than no. She shook her head. It's not more complicated. That's the version you'd tell yourself to make it feel manageable. It's exactly that simple. You brought this here. To Micah. To my house. Her voice cracked at the edge of the last sentence, and she controlled it quickly, with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has not had the luxury of falling apart when she needed to, and has therefore developed significant capacity to not fall apart. I spent 3 years building a life where he was safe, where I was safe. And you even coming here with good intentions, you. I know, don't. She held up a hand. Don't say you know. Don't be agreeable right now. I need you to actually hear this. I'm hearing it. You found our address without telling me. Someone found you finding our address. My son's face is in a photograph on some criminal's phone. Her voice had gone flat with the effort of keeping it steady. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? Yes. No, you don't. Because if you understood, you'd understand that the thing I'm most afraid of right now isn't whoever sent those photographs. The thing I'm most afraid of is that you're going to tell me it's handled, and I'm going to believe you, and 6 months from now, something else from your world is going to find its way to my front door. She looked at him directly. I have been afraid of exactly this since the day you showed up at the farmer's market. I have been afraid that letting you near us meant letting your world near us. Darius had no answer for that, because she was right. And because the terrible irony of it was that the world she was describing, the world that had sent the photographs, was the world he was dismantling, precisely because of her. Because of Micah. The dismantling was the attempt to close the gap between what he'd been and what they needed him to be. And the dismantling itself had generated the threat because the men who benefited from his continuation were not interested in his growth as a human being. I need to call Garrett, Darius said. Your lawyer. Yes. I need to accelerate what we're building. The transition. I was planning 18 months. I need it faster. How much faster? I don't know. I have to see what's possible without... He stopped. Without what? He looked at her. Without making it dangerous, in the process of trying to make it safe. The words were barely out before his phone buzzed. He looked at it. A message from his security chief. Renford is not alone. He's been in contact with 3 parties over the last 72 hours. One of them is federal. Darius's blood went cold, not the cold of danger. The specific cold of a man who has just understood the shape of something he'd been misreading. Renford wasn't trying to pull him back. Renford was building a case. The photographs of Nia and Micah weren't leveraged to force Darius's return. They were a demonstration that Renford knew where his vulnerabilities were a preview of what could be disclosed, and to whom, in whatever arrangement, Renford was constructing with federal contacts. Not a threat to bring Darius back to the Empire. A threat to expose Darius if he didn't cooperate with Renford's own positioning. Renford was going to use Darius's exit to negotiate his own ascension. And if that negotiation included offering federal contacts information about Darius's past, and it obviously did, that was the commodity Renford was trading then. The 18-month careful transition that Garrett was building became something different. It became evidence of awareness. It became consciousness of guilt, dressed up as corporate restructuring. The very documents Darius had been signing became potential exhibits. I have to go, Darius said. Nia looked at him. I know that's exactly what you expected me to say, he said. And I know what it looks like. But there is something happening right now that changes the nature of this problem. And I need... Go, she said. The word was very quiet. Not permission. Not forgiveness. Just the exhausted sound of a woman watching a pattern repeat with slight variations. Naya, I heard everything you said. I believe most of it. She turned toward the door. But right now I need to go check on my son, and you need to go manage whatever this is. That's where we are. I'm going to fix this. She stopped with her hand on the door. I've been listening to you for 6 years, she said, without turning around. I know the difference between when you mean something and when you need to mean it. She paused. I don't know which one this is yet. She went inside. The door closed, not slammed, which was almost worse. Darius stood on the porch of the small white house for a moment that felt longer than it was, then walked back to his car and called Garrett from the driveway. Tell me everything about the federal angle, he said, when Garrett answered. Garrett was quiet for a moment. The wrong kind of quiet, the quiet of a man receiving a statement that connects to something he was already aware of. What federal angle? Garrett said. Darius went still. Garrett, I don't have information about a federal census. Who in your office leaked the transition documents? We're still investigating, Garrett. His voice dropped to something below quiet. I have been your client for 9 years. I have paid you more than most people see in a lifetime. I have taken your counsel on matters that required absolute trust and given you every reason to maintain that trust in the other direction. So I'm going to ask you one more time, and I need you to understand that whatever you say next establishes the terms of everything that follows. Silence. There was an approach, Garrett said finally. Several weeks ago, someone contacted a junior associate in the office about a specific document. What document? An internal memo from 3 years ago. About the port arrangement. Darius closed his eyes. The port arrangement was the oldest and cleanest piece of exposure in his entire history, a transaction from 3 years ago that had passed through his corporate structure in a way that was technically obscured, but not technically clean. He had known about it. He had accepted the risk. It was the kind of thing that existed in his world, the way certain structural cracks exist in old buildings present, noted, and lived with because the building was still standing. Someone had that document. Who approached the associate? Darius said. A pause. The name given was Renford, Garrett said. But the approach was coordinated. He wasn't acting alone. Who was he acting with? There was a woman present at one of the meetings, Garrett said. The associate described her. Blonde. Mid-30s. The description matches someone I've seen in your offices previously. Darius's hand tightened on the phone. Describe her. Garrett described her, and the description matched Celine Marrow in every particular. Celine, who had been present in his professional world for 3 years. Celine who had seen documents and heard conversations and been given proximity that he had never once questioned because she was useful and comfortable. And he had confused usefulness and comfort with loyalty, the way powerful men consistently and catastrophically confuse those things. Celine, who he had ended things with in a 4-minute conversation 2 months ago. Celine, who had taken it well. People like Celine always took these things well on the surface. They had contingency plans. His contingency was apparently Renford and a federal contact and a 3-year-old document about the port arrangement and the address of a small White House in Greyhaven, where a woman was currently checking on her son and asking herself whether the man who just stood on her porch was telling the truth. Garrett, Darius said, stop the transition filings. All of them. Don't move anything until I tell you to. If we stop now, mid-process, it looks worse. I understand what it looks like. Stop them. Darius, if there's a federal investigation in progress and they pull the documents we've already filed, how long do I have before they can pull them? A long silence. Honestly, I don't know. If Renford has already made the approach and offered the port document as a preliminary, the timeline depends on how seriously the federal side is taking it. If they're building a case, Garrett stopped. If they're building a case, you might already be past the point where the transition helps you. What does that mean? It means the transition's designed to look like reform. If there's an active investigation in progress, it stops looking like reform and starts looking like asset dissipation. Flight preparation, he paused. It becomes evidence against you, instead of evidence for you. Darius sat in the car in Nia's driveway, with this information settling over everything. The careful 18-month plan, the signed documents, the meetings with Villanueva. All of it had been designed to walk him out of the empire cleanly, to leave a legitimate structure behind, to give Micah, a father who lived outside, the thing that had defined his worst years. Every piece of it had been built with the precision he applied to everything, with the full resources of his attorney and his remaining goodwill and his genuine desire to become something different. And Celine had been watching him build it, and Renford had been waiting. And together, they had taken his most honest act and turned it into a weapon. The front window of the small White House was lit from inside. Darius could see the shadow of something moving behind the sea glass curtains. Micah, probably, the small flight path of a wooden airplane through a warm room. He thought about what Nia had said. I know the difference between when you mean something and when you need to mean it. He thought about what it would cost now to mean it in the way that the situation required. The empire could not be exited carefully anymore. The careful exit had been found and compromised from within. The only thing left was a choice between two kinds of exposure. The exposure of going back, which meant Nia's prediction came true, and his world followed him here forever, or the exposure of going forward, which meant finishing what he'd started at a cost that would be significantly higher than he'd planned for. He thought about Marcus standing down. He thought about Renford. He thought about Celine receiving a 4-minute conversation with the practiced composure of a woman who has a contingency plan. He thought about all the things he had built and protected and refused to surrender for 20 years. And he thought about the single thing he had failed to build and protect and had surrendered without fully understanding he was doing it, one canceled appointment at a time. Then he made the only decision that was consistent with the person he had decided, on a rainy night, in a cheap motel room, to become. He called Garrett back. Don't stop the filings, he said. Darius, I just explained. I heard you. Continue the filings. He looked at the window of the house. And I need you to find me the best federal criminal attorney in New York. Not someone associated with my current situation. Someone clean. Someone I've never worked with. Silence. You're going to walk into this. I'm going to walk through it, Darius said. There's a difference. If they have the port document, then they have it. Find me an attorney. He paused. Tonight. He ended the call. He sat for one more moment in the car, in the driveway of the small White House, looking at the shadow of his son moving behind the curtain, the small arc of a wooden airplane over a warm room. Then he reversed out of the driveway and drove toward the highway and the city and the thing that was coming toward him, whether he drove toward it or not. And the only question left was whether the man who drove into it was the man who had built the empire or the man who had sat in a rocking chair under a ceiling of handmade stars and understood too late what he had been choosing. He drove back to Manhattan in 2 hours and 40 minutes, which was faster than the distance allowed for, on a normal night, and he did not think about speed or traffic or the machinery of the drive at all, because the machinery of the drive was not what his mind was doing. His mind was doing the accounting, every name, every document, every conversation that had happened in Celine's presence over 3 years, every file that had moved through Garrett's office, every moment where he had been the most powerful man in a room and had therefore been the least suspicious of the people orbiting that power, because powerful men almost universally make the same mistake. They track threats from below and from outside, and they consistently fail to track threats from beside them, from the people they've given proximity and warmth, and the particular intimacy of being useful. Celine had been beside him for 3 years. He thought about all the things she had seen. He got to the city at 11:40 and went directly to the address. Garrett had sent him not his office, not the mansion, but a building in Midtown that contained the offices of a woman named Patricia Solano, who was apparently the attorney Garrett had located, and who was apparently willing to meet at midnight, because Garrett had communicated the urgency in terms that made midnight sound reasonable. The lobby was empty, except for a security guard who checked his name against a list and sent him up without conversation. Patricia Solano was in her 50s, compact and direct, with the kind of face that had processed a very large number of bad situations and had developed an accurate resting expression for receiving new ones present, unhurried, assessing, without performance. She had 2 associates with her, both younger, both with laptops open and legal pads ready, in the way of people who had also been called in at midnight and were professional enough not to make that visible. "Sit down," she said before he was fully through the door. He sat. "Tell me everything," she said. "Not the version you'd tell a business associate. The actual version." He told her. He was precise. He had always been precise with information, organizing it, sequencing it, understanding which details carried weight and which were decorative. He told Solano about the port arrangement and the document, about Renford's approach to Garrett's associate, about Celine's involvement, about the photographs of Micah, about the transition plan and the filings and the timeline. He told her about the federal contact without knowing who specifically it was, because Marcus had found the pattern, but not the name. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone totaling a column of numbers. "The port document," she said. "Walk me through it." He did. She asked 4 questions. They were very specific questions, the kind that required him to access memories he had preferred to keep at a comfortable distance. He answered all 4, accurately, because accuracy was the only useful thing he could offer her, and because he had already decided, on the drive here, that this was the version of this problem, where honesty with his attorney was the foundational requirement, and compromising it was the first step toward a worse outcome. "Okay," she said. "Okay, what?" "Okay, I understand what we're working with." She leaned back. "The document is 3 years old, and the transaction it describes was structured in a way that is technically exposable, but not automatically criminal. It depends heavily on intent, on what was known by whom, and on whether a prosecutor can establish a pattern." She looked at him. "Can they establish a pattern?" He was quiet for a moment. "There are other transactions," he said. "How many?" He told her. She held the number without reaction. "All in the same structure. Similar structures. Some cleaner than others. And the transition documents you've been filing. They were designed to establish a legitimate exit, to show a clean break with the corporate structures that interfaced with the other side." "Right. And now that a federal contact is in the picture, those filings potentially look like consciousness of guilt rather than reform." She said it the same way Garrett had said it, flatly, as a professional accounting of a professional problem. "So we have a narrow window." "How narrow?" "Depends on how far along the federal side is. If they're preliminary, weeks. If they're serious, maybe days." She looked at her associates. "I need the filings pulled tonight. All of them. I need to see exactly what's been submitted and what's pending." One of the associates was already on the phone. In the meantime, Solano said, returning to Darius, "Tell me about Renford." "He's been with my organization for 11 years. He runs northern operations. He's smart, he's careful, and he was in contact with Salazar's people before I understood what he was doing. And Celine Marrow, 3 years in my professional environment. She had access to conversations and documents that she should not have been given access to, in retrospect." In retrospect, Solano repeated, with the neutral tone of someone noting something, without editorializing about it. "Yes. Were they working together from the beginning, or did this arrangement develop later? I don't know. Finding out matters. If they've been coordinating for an extended period, the federal contact may have more than just the port document. They may have a pattern built from multiple sources over an extended timeline, which is a more serious exclusion than a single document from a disgruntled lieutenant." "How do I find out?" "Very carefully," she said, "and not through any channel connected to your current operations. Everything you do from this moment goes through me. No calls to anyone in your organization about this. No meetings. No messages. Nothing that could be characterized as tampering with potential witnesses. Renford is not a potential witness. He's the threat." "He may be both," she said. "That's the nature of this." The people who cause the problem are also frequently the people who can resolve it, depending on how the federal side handles their relationship with him. She paused. Do you know if Renford has been offered a formal arrangement? I don't know. That's what we need to know first. She stood, which was apparently a signal that the preliminary portion of the conversation was complete. I'm going to need 48 hours to assess the full picture. In the meantime, I need you to be completely unremarkable. Go somewhere, stay there. Don't do anything that registers. There are people in my organization who will read my inactivity as, I understand. You can communicate that you're handling a personal matter. Nothing more specific than that. She looked at him directly. And the personal matter. The woman and the child in Greyhaven. Are they secured? Secured. I mean physically. If Renford has the address and is willing to use them as leverage. I need to handle that, Darius said. Handle it through legitimate means. Private security that is completely outside your existing network. People who cannot be connected to your organization. I can give you a name. She gave him a name. He wrote it down. He left her office at 1:15 in the morning and stood on the sidewalk in the midtown air, which had the quality of city air at that hour, slightly cooler than the day, the smell of exhaust and concrete and the faint ghost of 1,000 daily routines that had all concluded hours ago. He called the security contact Solano had given him. The man answered on the second ring, which meant either he never slept or Solano had called ahead. He had the voice of someone accustomed to receiving late calls about urgent problems and had calibrated his entire professional demeanor around projecting that nothing was urgent enough to be interesting. Darius gave him the Greyhaven address. He described Nia and Micah. He said he needed discreet physical presence in the vicinity, not intrusive, not visible, not connected to anything that had his name on it. Understood, the man said. How long? Until I tell you otherwise. Starting when? 2 hours ago. The man absorbed this. We'll backfill. Darius ended the call. He drove to the mansion, and he went to the study, and he sat at the desk, and he looked at the signed documents and the legal pads and the architecture of the transition that had seemed so clean and careful 6 weeks ago when he'd started building it. When the problem had been the size of his own choices, and the solution had seemed to be simply making better ones. He had not accounted for the people who profited from his bad choices, refusing to accept his better ones. At 3 a.m, his phone rang. The number was blocked, which meant it was either Garrett operating through a secondary line or someone he'd prefer not to hear from. He answered. You called your lawyer, said a voice that was not Renford. A voice he didn't immediately recognize measured. Male, middle-aged. Who is this? Someone who's been watching your situation with significant professional interest. A pause. My name isn't relevant. What's relevant is that I'm aware you've retained Patricia Solano and that her involvement changes the timeline of certain things. Federal, Darius thought. The voice had the particular quality of someone accustomed to speaking carefully in recorded environments. I'm not going to have a conversation without my attorney present, Darius said. That's a reasonable position. I respect it. Another pause. I'm not calling to have a conversation. I'm calling to tell you that the individual who approached your attorney's office with the document in question has been in communication with us for approximately 6 weeks, and that the individual has provided us with certain materials that have broadened the scope of our interest. Darius said nothing. I'm also calling to tell you that the individual is not currently a cooperative witness in any formal arrangement. He is a source. The distinction matters. The voice was careful, deliberate, placing words the way you place feet on uncertain ground. The path between source and witness is shorter than people think, but it is not instantaneous. What do you want? I want you to understand the timeline before your attorney tells you a version of it that's professionally accurate but personally incomplete. A pause. You have approximately 2 hours before a decision is made about formalizing the arrangement with your source. After that decision is made, the conversation you could have had with us before it becomes significantly more expensive. More expensive how? In terms of what you'd need to offer versus what we'd still need in exchange. The voice shifted slightly. Mr. Vane, I've been looking at your situation for 6 weeks. I've read the transition documents. I've looked at what you're building in Garrett's office. I have a picture of where you were and where you appear to be trying to go. A long pause. I'm not calling to threaten you. I'm calling because the source is motivated by something other than justice, and I think you understand what that motivation is. Renford wants position. Renford wants to step into a vacuum. If that vacuum is created by a formal prosecution, he benefits. If the vacuum is created some other way, if the structure is legitimately dismantled rather than collapsed, his leverage disappears, and his usefulness to us diminishes significantly. Another pause. That dynamic is one I thought you should understand before. You have a conversation with your attorney about options. You're telling me to cooperate. I'm telling you to call your attorney in the morning and have a conversation about what voluntary cooperation looks like versus what compelled cooperation looks like. The voice was very steady. Those are different experiences. I've watched both from the same distance, and they're genuinely different. The call ended. Darius sat in the study until 4 in the morning, when the sky outside began to make its first gray concession toward, and then he went to the bedroom and lay down without undressing and stared at the ceiling. He thought about Renford's face in his mind, a man he'd trusted with operations for 11 years, a man who'd eaten at his table, a man whose son had been given a job in the legitimate side of Darius's corporate structure as a favor 2 years ago. He thought about Celine, her bright and careful presence across every breakfast at the penthouse, the way she'd absorbed information with the practiced subtlety of someone who understood that the value of is everything you hear when people stop thinking about what they're saying. He thought about Patricia Solano saying, "The people who cause the problem are also frequently the people who can resolve it." He thought about Naya and the door closing and the sound of it. At 5, he called Solano's cell. She answered in 2 rings. "I received a call," he said. "I assumed you might. Tell me exactly what was said," he told her. She was quiet for a moment after. 72 hours, she said. That's what he said. Okay. He could hear her thinking the particular quality of a legal mind sorting categories at speed. This is actually useful information. Renford hasn't been formalized. That means there's still a window where his leverage is potential rather than actual. She paused. But I want to be very clear about something. The path I'm about to outline requires you to do something that is going to be significantly uncomfortable. Tell me. You're going to have to give them something real, she said. Not Renford, not any individual, something structural. Something that lets them close a case that has been building for longer than 6 weeks. Something that makes the court document a resolution rather than a beginning. She paused. That means documentation of things you would prefer remained undocumented. It means conversations you'd prefer didn't happen on a record. And it means the transition plan we were building becomes something different, not a clean exit, but a negotiated exit with conditions. What conditions? That's what the next 72 hours determines. He said nothing for a moment. There's one more thing, Solano said. Say it. The woman and the child. They're not implicated in anything currently, which is good. But if this becomes formal before we negotiate terms, their location is going to become part of the evidentiary picture. People are going to want to know the full scope of your personal situation, your assets, your relationships. She paused. She needs to know that this is coming. From you, not from a federal process server. Darius closed his eyes. I know he today, Solano said. Before I start the conversation with the other side, she needs to hear it from you first. He drove to Greyhaven in the pale early morning, while the city was still deciding whether to fully wake up, and he was on the coastal highway when the sun came fully over the water and turned everything bronze and flat and clean, the kind of morning that was beautiful in a way that felt slightly insulting, given the nature of what he was driving toward. He parked on the street. He sat for 10 minutes. He knocked on the door at 7:45. Naya opened it in a robe, her hair loose, and she looked at him with the expression of a woman who has spent the night processing the previous conversation and has arrived at some conclusions. You came back, she said. I said I would. You also said a lot of other things last night. She stepped back from the door, which was not an invitation but was not a refusal. He entered. The house was warm. It smelled like coffee and something baked the ordinary domestic smell of a Saturday morning in a home where a child would be awake soon and would expect breakfast and would not care about federal timelines or corporate transitions or the complicated machinery of a world that was trying to find its way through the front door. Micah's still sleeping, Naya said. You have maybe 20 minutes. I'll be done before that. They stood in her kitchen and he told her. He told her about Solano, about the call at 3 in the morning, about the 72 hours, about what cooperation meant and what it would require and what would happen if the process became formal before the negotiation was complete. He told her that her location was going to become known, regardless that the choice now was between it becoming known through a voluntary process that he could partially shape or through an involuntary one that he could not shape at all. He told her that private security was already in the vicinity, discreetly, people with no connection to his organization, and that they would stay until this was resolved. He told her that the version of the exit he'd planned was gone, and what was coming instead was harder and more public, and would cost him things he hadn't planned to lose. She listened to all of it over a cup of coffee that she held in both hands and did not drink. When he finished, she said, "What happens to you?" "I don't know exactly. Solano thinks the cooperation angle is viable. The exposure is real but manageable if the negotiation goes well. There's a version of this where I come out with a consent arrangement and no criminal record." He paused. "There's also a version where I don't." "What's the version where you don't?" "If Renford formalizes before we do. If the port document is enough on its own to establish the pattern they need. If the federal side decides the negotiated resolution isn't in their interest." He looked at her directly. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know the actual range of outcomes and not a version I've cleaned up to protect you from it." Naya looked at him. "You could run," she said. "Yes. You have the resources. You could be somewhere without extradition by tonight if you wanted." "Yes. But you're here, yes." She set the coffee cup down on the counter. She looked at it for a moment and then looked back at him with the expression she'd had on the porch the night before, the probability, calculating expression, the one that was running his history against his present and trying to determine which one was more predictive. "Why?" she said. "Because running means taking my world with me wherever I go. And my world is the thing that's been following you." He held her gaze. "The only version of this where Micah is actually safe is the one where I go through this, not around it." The sound of small feet on the stairs. They both turned. Micah appeared at the bottom of the stairs in pajamas with what appeared to be rockets on them. His hair pressed flat on one side from sleep, the wooden airplane held against his chest with one arm. He looked at Darius. "You're here early," Micah said, with the straightforward observation of a child who notes discrepancies without judgment. "Yeah," Darius said. "Did you eat?" "Not yet." Micah thought about this. "Mommy makes good eggs," he said. "You should stay for eggs." Darius looked at Nia. Nia looked at Micah for a moment, with the expression of a woman navigating a situation that has just been made more complicated by the completely uncomplicated logic of a 3-year-old. "Go wash your hands, baby," she said. Micah went back upstairs. Nia looked at Darius. "Stay for eggs," she said. Not warmly. Not coldly, just plainly, the way you say a fact. "Okay." They did not speak for the 20 minutes it took to make breakfast. She made eggs, and he stood in the kitchen with his hands in his pockets and did not try to help because it would have required inserting himself into the physical choreography of her kitchen. And that was not something he had the right to yet, and he knew it. Micah came back down and ate with the focused efficiency of a child who has somewhere internal to be after breakfast. And at one point, he looked up from his eggs and said to Darius, "Blue Thunder needs a new paint job," as if this was something they'd been discussing for a while, and he was picking up a thread. "What color?" Darius said. "Red, with a yellow stripe." "Classic." "I know." After breakfast, Micah took the airplane to the living room, and Nia and Darius stood at the kitchen sink with the dishes between them. "You need to go," she said. "I know. How long until this is until you know which version?" 72 hours from last night. Maybe less. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to tell you it's going to be fine. I don't need you to, because I don't know if it's going to be fine. And I'm done saying things I don't know. are true just because they're easier to say. I understand. She turned from the sink and looked at him with the full directness she'd always been capable of when she'd decided to stop managing the distance between what she felt and what she said. I need you to understand something, she said. Whatever happens in the next 72 hours, the outcome, the legal situation, whatever version you come out of this as the question of us, is separate from that. She held his gaze. I'm not going to take you back because you went through something hard. That's not how this works. You understand that? Yes. I'm watching what you do when it's hard. Not what you say. What you actually do. She paused. Go do it. He went. He was back on the highway when Solano called. The timeline just changed, she said, and her voice had the quality of someone who has received information that has reorganized their morning. Renford made contact with the federal side this morning. He's moving toward formalization faster than the contact indicated last night. Darius's hand tightened on the wheel. How much time? Maybe 36 hours. Maybe less. She paused. I need you in my office in 2 hours. We're going to draft a voluntary disclosure package, and I'm going to make a call that I need to make before noon today. I'll be there. There's one more thing. Her voice shifted slightly, not unprofessional, but human in the particular way it went when the information was personal rather than procedural. The federal contact from last night. I know who he is. I've worked with him before, she paused. He's serious and he's fair. That's the best possible combination. But fair doesn't mean easy. Another pause. Are you ready to do this? Darius looked at the highway ahead of him. The morning had gone full and bright now, the water visible to the east, the kind of day that looked like it was built for something ordinary. Yes, he said. He drove. The 2 hours between Greyhaven and Solano's office were the last 2 hours of a life he had spent 20 years constructing, and he spent them doing what he had spent the night doing, the accounting. The full honest accounting. Not the version he'd told others, but the version he carried internally, the one that included everything that had been worth building and everything that had been built at cost to things that were worth more. He thought about Micah saying you should stay for eggs with the complete, uncomplicated confidence of a child who has not yet learned that some invitations are complicated. He thought about Nia at the sink, not looking at him, saying go do it. He arrived at Solano's building at 10 minutes to 9 and went directly up. And when he came through the door, she was already on her feet, and her 2 associates were already at the table, and there were 3 legal pads and a recorder on the table and a carafe of coffee that looked like it had been there since before dawn. Sit, she said. He sat. Before we start, she said, looking at him with the full weight of what she was about to say, I need to know one thing. Not for the legal strategy. For me, because I'm about to put my reputation inside this with you. Ask it, the exit, the transition, was it real? He looked at her. Yes, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she sat down and picked up her pen and said, then, let's build something we can prove. What followed was 4 hours of the most exhaustive conversation Darius had ever participated in, more exhaustive than any negotiation, any confrontation, any deposition he'd ever navigated. Because those had all required precision about what he was willing to reveal while simultaneously protecting what he was not. This required the opposite. This required him to dismantle the architecture of strategic information management he had spent 20 years perfecting and lay everything underneath it out on a conference table for a woman with a legal pad and a recorder and no interest whatsoever in his comfort. He laid it out. Every transaction, every structure, every arrangement that had existed at the intersection of legitimate and not. Every name he could give without endangering someone who didn't deserve the endangerment. Every piece of the picture that was his to give. It took 4 hours. At 1:30 in the afternoon, Solano picked up her phone and made a call. The call lasted 11 minutes. When she ended it, she looked at Darius with the expression of someone who has just made a bet of significant size and is waiting for the table to resolve. He's willing to meet, she said. Today, 4 o'clock. And Renford. If we get to the table before Renford formalizes, Renford's leverage disappears. He becomes a source with outdated information and a motivation problem. She paused. But we have to get to the table first. Then let's get to the table. There's something you should know before we walk in. She set her pen down. The terms they're likely to propose are going to include restrictions on your business activities, on certain associations. There will be monitoring for a period. There will be constraints on your autonomy that a man with your history is going to find very uncomfortable. I understand. And there's a strong possibility, she continued, that even with full cooperation, there are aspects of the port arrangement that cannot be fully mitigated. A consent decree, possibly a fine of significant size. She paused. Possibly more than that, depending on what they've already built independently of Renford. Darius looked at her. Tell me the worst version, he said. She told him. He sat with the worst version for a moment. He thought about Micah's rocket pajamas. He thought about the wooden airplane with its slightly imperfect wing. He thought about a child who had not yet learned that some invitations are complicated and had therefore extended one with complete confidence. Okay, Darius said. Okay, let's go. They were in the car, Solano and her senior associate and Darius, heading toward a federal building in Lower Manhattan at 3:15 in the afternoon, when Darius's phone buzzed with a message from the security contact in Greyhaven. He opened it. Unidentified vehicle has been parked across from the subject address for 40 minutes. Occupant has not exited. New York plates. Do you want us to approach? Darius looked at the message. He looked at the back of Solano's head. He thought about Renford, who was 36 hours away from formalizing, who was losing leverage by the hour, and who knew it, and who had apparently decided that losing leverage called for a demonstration. He typed back, stay visible. Not aggressive, just visible. Then he looked out the window at the city, passing at 3:15 in the afternoon, on a day that had started before dawn, in a small white house, where a boy in rocket pajamas had asked a man he'd known for 3 weeks if he'd eaten breakfast yet. The federal building was 12 minutes away. Renford was somewhere in this city, reading the situation, understanding that the window was closing, understanding that the man he'd spent 6 weeks trying to pressure was not folding the way he'd expected him to fold. And Darius Vane, who had spent 20 years as the most dangerous person in any room he occupied, sat in the back of a car on the way to voluntarily walk into a federal meeting and hand over everything he'd spent 20 years protecting, because the alternative was a life that kept following his family home, and because a 3-year-old had handed him a wooden airplane and asked if he was going to keep coming, and because some questions, once asked with enough honesty, don't leave room for the answer you used to give. The car pulled up to the building. Solano turned to look at him. Ready, she said. Not a question. Darius opened the door. The afternoon air hit him, city air, October cold now, smelling of stone and exhaust and the particular quality of Manhattan in the early fall when the light goes sideways and turns everything briefly. The federal building had the particular smell of institutional permanence, recycled air, floor wax, the accumulated weight of 10,000 serious conversations conducted in rooms designed to be uncomfortable. Darius walked through the lobby security with Solano at his left shoulder and her associate at his right, and he did not hesitate at the metal detector or the badge check or the elevator that took them to the 7th floor, because hesitating was the thing you did when you were still deciding, and he had finished deciding somewhere on the coastal highway between Greyhaven and the city, with the morning light coming flat off the water. The room they were shown to was not dramatic. That was the first thing he noted. He had expected something that matched the weight of the occasion, something architectural, something that communicated the gravity of federal authority. Instead, it was a conference room with a table that had seen better years and chairs that were ergonomically adequate and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. A water pitcher in the center, a clock on the wall that was 1 minute slow, which he clocked immediately, and which bothered him in the small, persistent way of a man accustomed to precision. The federal contact from the phone call was already in the room. His name was Harlan Webb, and he was exactly what his voice had suggested, mid-50s, precise, with the kind of face that had been carefully maintained at a neutral expression for so long that the neutral expression had become his actual face. He had 2 people with him, both younger, both with the look of people who processed documents for a living and were very good at it. Webb stood when they came in. He shook Solano's hand, then Darius's. "Mr. Vane," he said. "Mr. Webb," they sat. Webb looked at Darius for a moment with the expression of a man conducting a final assessment before a significant transaction. Darius let him look. He understood the purpose of it. Webb was reading for commitment, for the specific quality of a man who has made a decision he is going to maintain versus a man who is performing a decision he is going to revisit. Darius had read people for the same quality across 20 years of negotiations, where the stakes were also very high, just differently denominated. "I appreciate you coming in," Webb said. "I appreciate the window," Darius said. Webb nodded once. "Then let me tell you where we are, and then Ms. Solano can tell me where you are, and we'll see if there's a conversation to have." He opened a folder. "We have been building a picture of your organization's activities for approximately 14 months. The port document that was recently provided to us by a source." A pause that communicated he understood that Darius knew who the source was useful in confirming elements of that picture, but it was not the origin of our interest. "We have independent threads." Darius did not react. "The independent threads cover 3 primary areas." Webb did not look at the folder while he spoke, which meant he was reciting from memory, which meant these 3 areas had been in his head for a long time. He named them. They were accurate. They were, in fact, the 3 areas Darius would have named if asked to identify his greatest exposure, which meant the picture Webb had built was not the partial picture of a 14-month investigation working from incomplete information. It was close to complete. Darius felt something in his chest that he categorized honestly as fear, not the manageable fear of a dangerous situation where action was available, but the deeper fear of a man who has realized that the room he is sitting in has been built around him for over a year, and the only question remaining is what happens inside it. "Our interest in proceeding formally," Webb continued, "depends on several factors. The cooperation of the individuals involved, the completeness of the picture we're able to establish, and the sincerity, let's call it, of any remedial steps taken." He looked at Darius directly. "The transition documents your attorney filed, we've reviewed them," and Solano said, "and they are consistent with what someone would file if they were genuinely trying to exit a structure of this kind. They're also consistent with what someone would file if they understood an investigation was in progress and were attempting to demonstrate reform." He paused. "The distinction matters enormously. Ask what you actually want to ask," Darius said. Solano put a hand briefly on his arm, a professional caution, not a personal one. Webb looked at him. "How long had you been planning to exit before you became aware of the investigation?" Darius held the question for a moment. "Before I was aware of any investigation," he said, "I received divorce papers and an ultrasound photograph and a note from my wife telling me to become someone worth knowing." He paused. "That was the beginning. Everything else followed from that." The room was quiet. Webb looked at him with the expression of a man who has heard a very large number of explanations in rooms like this one, and has developed an accurate instinct for which ones are constructed and which ones arrive from somewhere real. He wrote something on his pad. "All right," he said. "Let's talk about what cooperation looks like." What followed was 3 hours. 3 hours that Darius would not be able to fully reconstruct afterward, not because he was absent from them, but because they required a quality of presence that consumed everything, left no processing capacity for the simultaneous creation of memory. He answered questions. He provided names and dates and structures, and the internal logic of arrangements that had seemed, within the world that produced them, to have their own reasonable logic, and that sounded, articulated plainly in a federal conference room, like exactly what they were. He gave them Renford, not as revenge, as fact. Renford's activities, his contacts with Salazar's people, his approach to Garrett's associate, the photographs of Nia and Micah. Webb received all of it with the flat, professional attention of someone for whom this information confirmed things he already suspected. He did not give them Celine. Not because he was protecting her, he had no interest in protecting her, but because Solano had advised him, correctly, that Celine was a secondary actor whose primary function was to confirm Renford's access and whose formal involvement added complexity without adding value to the cooperation picture. Renford's arrangement with us is not formalized, Webb said toward the end of the third hour. Based on what you've provided today, his utility as a source is significantly diminished. The picture he was offering to complete is already complete. A pause. That changes his position considerably. What does that mean for him? Darius said. It means he's a person who has been in contact with a federal investigation with the intent of leveraging that contact for personal positioning and who has demonstrated willingness to use civilians. Webb paused on the word, and Darius understood that Webb had seen the report on the photographs, had read what Renford had been willing to do, as instruments of that leverage. That's a problem for him that exists independently of your situation. Darius nodded. At 4:57, Webb collected his folder and looked at Solano. I'll have a preliminary terms framework to you by end of week, he said. We're not in a position to finalize today, but I can tell you the broad outlines of what cooperation at this level enables. He told them. The broad outlines were not easy. There was a consent decree. There were financial penalties of us that would require liquidation of significant assets. There were monitoring conditions. There were restrictions on certain categories of business activity for a period of years. There was, in the more probable of the two outcome scenarios, Webb described, no criminal record, but the less probable scenario still existed, and its existence was contingent on the completeness of the cooperation and the absence of any material that would surface later to contradict what had been provided today. Darius accepted all of it without negotiating. Solano looked at him sideways. When he did this, the look of an attorney who is professionally obligated to push back on terms on behalf of her client and who is receiving a client who has decided that pushing back is not the point. We'll review the framework when it arrives, Solano said to Webb, covering for Darius's non-negotiation with professional smoothness. They shook hands again at the door. In the elevator, Solano looked at Darius. You didn't push back on the financial terms, she said. No, there's negotiating room in the penalty structure. I've seen cases like this, I know. He looked at the elevator doors. I don't want to negotiate. I want to be finished. She studied him for a moment. Okay, she said. How long until the framework? He said end of week, realistically Monday. She paused. And Renford? He'll be handled, Darius said. Not by me. By the situation he created. Webb's people will move on him now that his utility is gone. Yes, she said. That's correct. The elevator opened. They walked out into the late afternoon, which had gone from the sideways October light. He'd noted, on the way into a full early dark, the city switching over from the machinery of day to the machinery of evening, lights coming on in windows. The shift change of a place that never fully stops. Solano turned to him on the sidewalk. You did the right thing in there, she said. I want you to know that I don't say that to make my clients feel better. I say it when it's accurate, he nodded. Go somewhere, sir, she said. Not the mansion. Somewhere that isn't connected to this. He drove to Greyhaven. He drove there not because it was strategic, and not because he had been invited, but because it was the only place that existed. In that moment, as real the small white house with the bird bath, and the training wheel bicycle, and the sea glass curtains, and the warm smell of eggs and coffee, that had been the most ordinary, and therefore the most unreachable thing in his life for 3 years. And that was now the only direction that made sense. He arrived at 8 in the evening. The house was lit from inside. The porch light was on. He sat in the car for 5 minutes. Then he knocked. Naya opened the door, and she looked at him. And she read his face the way she had always been able to read his face, and whatever she found there made something in her own face shift, not relief, not yet, but the specific expression of a woman who has been braced for a particular outcome and has received a different one and needs a moment to adjust to the different one. Come in, she said. Micah was asleep. She told him this before he could ask, which meant she had considered what he would ask first, and had answered it preemptively, which was one of the small intimacies of knowing someone well. They sat at the kitchen table. He told her what had happened. He told her about Webb and the 3 hours and the terms in Renford and what came next. He told her about the financial penalties and the consent decree and the monitoring conditions. He told her what the next year was going to look like, and what the year after that might look like depending on how the terms finalized. She listened to all of it with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on his face. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The man in the car outside," she said. "From this morning, security I arranged. They would have stayed until this was resolved." He paused. "Webb's people will move on Renford. The threat to your location ends with Renford's utility as a source, which ended this afternoon. So we're safe, yes. Micah is safe, yes." She looked at the table. Then at him. "You walked into a federal meeting and gave them everything." "Yes." "What does that cost you?" He told her the number. She looked at him. "You have enough left," he said. I'm not going to be unable to support." "That's not what I was thinking about," she said. "What were you thinking about?" "I was thinking about who you were when I met you," she said. "The man who walked into a room and immediately understood where the power was and moved toward it. I was thinking about how much of your life has been organized around the accumulation of things that couldn't be taken from you." She paused. "And I was thinking that you just gave most of it away voluntarily." "Not most of it," he said. She looked at him. "Not what matters," he said. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the Greyhaven night was doing what it did the water moving in the dark at the edge of the town, the particular silence of a place that had decided against too much noise a long time ago and had maintained that decision across generations. "I can't promise you anything tonight," Nyssa said finally. "I need you to understand that. Whatever happened in that building today doesn't resolve us. That's a separate thing. I know. I don't want you to have done this expecting it to resolve us." "I didn't do it expecting anything," he said. "I did it because it was the only way to be finished with the thing that has been following me, and because I was not willing to let that thing follow you and Micah for another year while I tried to manage it from a distance." He looked at her directly. "That's why I did it. Not for a result, because it was the right thing." She studied him. "You've never said that before," she said. "Not in 6 years. I've never heard you use the phrase the right thing without it, meaning the strategically correct thing." "I know. It sounds different when it means what it's supposed to mean." "I know," she stood. She went to the counter and stood with her back to him for a moment, and he could see her breathing, the small rise and fall of her shoulders, the slight movement of her taking a breath that was longer than necessary and releasing it slowly. "Micah asked about you tonight," she said, still not turning. "At dinner, he asked if you were going to come back." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know yet." She turned. "I want to tell him something different. I'm not there yet, but I want to be." She held his gaze. "That's the most honest thing I can give you right now." "It's enough," he said. He left before 9 so that the night could settle back into what it was supposed to be, a house where a small boy slept with a wooden airplane and his mother sat in the quiet of a kitchen that smelled like the life she'd built, and where the presence of a man who was still in the process of becoming something better was not yet so established that his absence felt like loss. He drove to the motel. The same one, the same room. Even he asked for it specifically, and the woman at the desk gave him a look that communicated she found this request unusual, which he accepted. He sat in the chair by the window. He did not have the usual materials of his life around him. No files, no secure phone, no organization to manage, no empire to tend. The financial penalties Solano would negotiate in the coming week would strip away assets he'd spent 20 years accumulating. The consent decree would restrict his activities in ways that would make the version of himself that had existed 6 months ago completely unrecognizable. He sat with all of that, and found to his own surprise that it did not feel like loss the way he had expected it to feel. It felt instead like the end of a sustained physical effort, the particular exhaustion that comes after something long and hard has been completed. Not pleasant exactly, but honest in the way that honest exhaustion is different from the emptiness of having done nothing. He slept. For the first time in months, without interruption, without his phone waking him, without the cellular alertness of a man whose position required perpetual readiness for threat, he slept through the Greyhaven night while the water moved in the dark outside and the town did nothing in particular, and the morning took its time arriving. The terms came through Solano 10 days later. He reviewed them with her for 2 hours and signed them without the negotiation. She kept gently indicating was available, and the signature was the last major act of the life he was closing, not a dramatic act, not a cinematic one. Just a man in a lawyer's office, with a pen and a set of documents, and the understanding that some exits don't have a ribbon cutting. They just have a door that closes and doesn't reopen. Renford was arrested 4 days after that. Darius read about it in a brief message from Webb's office, professional, factual, no editorializing. Renford had been charged with a series of things that had nothing to do with Darius directly, which was the nature of the arrangement. The photographs of Naya and Micah became part of a separate matter, involving the use of civilians as instruments of leverage, which Webb had apparently found independently significant. Celine Marrow relocated to Europe sometime in the following weeks. He knew this because Garrett mentioned it in passing during a call about the liquidation process, and he received the information with the neutrality of a man hearing about someone who was no longer relevant to the shape of his days. He sold the Manhattan mansion in December. The penthouse had been relinquished months earlier, returned to the corporate structure that owned the building in a transaction so clean and so thoroughly documented that it would never be usable as evidence of anything except an orderly exit. He kept almost nothing, some books, personal effects, the jewelry that had belonged to his mother, the rocking chair from the nursery, which he transported to Greyhaven in the back of a rented truck, because it felt like the wrong thing to sell and the right thing to keep somewhere close to the stars that had been put up above it by a woman at 30 weeks pregnant on a stepladder. He rented a small house 6 streets from Naya's. It was smaller than anything he had lived in since his 20s. It had a porch that needed work and a yard that needed more, and a kitchen that had been last updated in a decade. He'd been in high school during. He fixed the porch himself over a series of weekends that were cold enough to make the work uncomfortable, and Micah came over and helped by holding tools and offering opinions about the quality of various boards. And Nisa stood on the sidewalk once watching them and said nothing but did not leave either. Every Saturday, without exception, he was at the farmer's market. Same time, same bench, or close to it. Coffee from the blue awning, which he had by now been getting long enough that the woman who ran it knew his order without being told. Micah found him every time, not because Darius positioned himself to be found. He stopped doing that. Stopped managing the geometry of their encounters, but because Micah was a child who moved through his Saturday morning with the unhurried certainty of someone who knows what he's looking for and expects to find it, and what he was looking for, increasingly, was Darius. Daddy. The word came out one Saturday in February, without ceremony, without announcement, without Micah appearing to notice that he'd said something different than he'd said before. He said it the way children say things, when the word has finally caught up with the reality. As a matter of fact, a label applied to a thing that has been true for a while and only now has the right name. Darius did not make a moment of it. He accepted it the way it was offered plainly, as a fact. Yeah, he said. Blue Thunder needs fuel, Micah said, holding out the airplane. What kind of fuel? The cinnamon roll kind. Darius looked at the airplane seriously. I think that's the right fuel. They went to the bakery. Nia was waiting at the bread table, and she looked at them coming across the market. The man and the boy, the airplane, the conversation that was visible in the movement of their faces, even at this distance, and something in her expression did the thing it had been doing incrementally over months. The thing that was not dramatic and not cinematic, but was the actual texture of trust rebuilding. It softened by one more degree. She did not say anything. She bought the bread. They walked through the market together, not as a unit, not as a declared thing, but as the three of them moving through the same space, at the same pace, which was its own kind of declaration. In March, Micah had a fever that lasted 3 days. Darius found out on the second day when Nia called him not to ask for help, but to tell him, which was a different thing, a thing that meant she had decided he was someone she told things to. He drove over immediately. He sat in the hallway outside Micah's room, while Nia was inside with him, and he did not go in unless invited, because the room belonged to Nia and to Micah, and his place in it was still earned incrementally, not assumed. She invited him in on the third day. He sat in a chair by the bed while Micah slept with the particular stillness of a sick child finally resting, and Nia sat on the edge of the bed with her hand on the boy's back, and the room was very quiet. "Thank you for coming," she said without looking at him. "Of course. She paused. "For coming when I called. For not," she stopped again. "I know what you mean," he said. She looked at him. "I know you do," she said. They sat in the quiet of the sick room while Micah breathed, and the afternoon moved across the window, and it was the most ordinary thing in the world, and it was also the thing that Darius had been furthest from for the longest time. And he held it carefully, the way you hold something that is still fragile, even when it has started to become real. The neighborhood gathering was in April, a spring thing, the kind of community event that Greyhaven appeared to organize with the regularity of a town that had decided collective gathering was not optional. Tables in the park, food from various families, children running in the particular uncoordinated way of children let loose in open space on a warm day. Micah disappeared into this chaos immediately, and Darius and Nia stood at the edge of it with plates of food and the slightly formal proximity of two people who have not yet named what they are to each other, but who are standing closer than strangers. Then Micah climbed onto a chair. He had a piece of paper, folded many times, slightly crumpled in the way of something that had been in a pocket, and taken out and reread and put back multiple times. He unfolded it with the serious care of a child who has prepared something and understands the preparation was important. The gathered adults went quiet, in the way adults go quiet for children who have clearly decided they have something to say. "When I was little," Micah began, "I thought family meant people living in one house." His voice had the particular cadence of a child, reading something he has worked on, slightly formal, slightly uncertain at the line break, deeply earnest in a way that makes the formality irrelevant. "Now I think family means the people who keep coming back." Darius looked at the ground. He looked at it for a long moment. He felt Nia's hand find his beneath the table, not reached for, not dramatic, just her hand moving to his hand, the way water moves to the lowest available point, because that is what water does when there is no longer a reason to hold it back. He did not move. He let her hand be there. After, when the evening had gathered itself up and the park was emptying and Micah was asleep across, two chairs pushed together with his jacket laid over him by his mother, Nia and Darius sat at the table in the near dark. "He wrote it himself," she said. "I know. I helped with the spelling. That's all. I know." She was quiet for a moment. "He asked me once, a few months ago, what I thought family was. I said I wasn't sure. I told him to think about what it felt like when people kept their promises." She looked at her hands. He took that and made something with it. Darius said nothing. "He's good," Nia said. "He is. He got that from somewhere." Darius looked at her. She was looking at Micah's sleeping face, and her expression was the expression of a woman who has made a very long and very difficult journey, and is sitting in a place she built herself, and is, for the first time in a long time, not afraid of what comes next. "Nia," he said. "Don't," she said, but gently. "I'm not going to make a speech." "Good, He stopped. "Start it over. I know what it cost you. All of it. I know the parts I was there for, and I know the parts I wasn't, and I know the second kind was bigger." He looked at Micah. "I'm not asking for those years back. I'm not asking to pretend they didn't happen. I wanted you to know that I know. Fully." He paused. "Without managing it into something easier to say." She was quiet. "I know you know," she said finally. "That's different than it was." She reached into her jacket pocket. He saw what she was holding before she said anything, the wedding ring, the one she'd been carrying. He had wondered, over the months, whether she still had it, whether it had been set aside somewhere or returned or simply lost in the geography of a life rebuilt from scratch. She had been carrying it. She looked at it for a moment in her palm. "I can't give you back what we were," she said. "I don't want it back." She looked at him. "Good," she said, "because what we were wasn't worth keeping." She closed her fingers around the ring and held it for one more moment, and he understood that the moment was not for him, it was for her. A private accounting of all the years and all the weight the small gold circle had carried, the hope it had represented, and the grief it had accumulated, and the long, strange journey from a hospital bag she'd packed just in case to a jacket pocket in a park in a small coastal town where she had, against all reasonable expectation, built a life she was willing to expand. Then she placed it in his palm. If we do this, she said, we build something new. Nothing from before counts as the foundation. We start at the ground. Yes. And you understand that means slow, yes. And if you she stopped herself. She looked at Micah's sleeping face. He's not a reason to stay. He can't be the only reason, because that's not fair to him, and it's not real for us. You understand that. The reason to stay is you, Darius said. Micah is the reason I started. You're the reason I stay. She held his gaze. Don't make me regret believing that, she said. I won't. She looked at the ring in his palm. Put it somewhere safe, she said. We'll figure out what it means later. He closed his hand around it. Later, much later, after Micah had been carried home half asleep and put to bed still wearing his shoes, because neither of them wanted to wake him. After the night had settled fully over Greyhaven, and the water was doing its patient work, in the dark Darius stood on the small porch of his rented house, 6 streets away, and looked at the ring in the light from the window. It was a small thing, gold, simple, the kind his mother would have approved of, not flashy, not designed to announce anything, just a circle that meant something to the people who understood what it meant. He had worn it for 6 years without understanding it. He turned it over in his hand. From somewhere in the direction of Nia's street, he could hear almost nothing, the town doing its quiet nighttime thing, the ocean at the far edge of everything, the creak of his porch in the April air. He thought about the list on the changing table. Build the crib. Attend the parenting class. Choose a lullaby. Take the first family photograph. Things they had been supposed to do before his sons arrived. Not one crossed off, left behind in a room full of stars that had been put up alone. The crib had eventually been built by Nia, he assumed, or with help from someone in this town who had been there when he wasn't. The photograph had happened without him. The lullaby he didn't know. But he knew, now that Micah slept with a wooden airplane, with a slightly imperfect wing. He knew that the boy took the fuel requirements of his aircraft seriously, and that cinnamon rolls were the accepted standard. He knew that Micah moved through a Saturday morning with the confidence of a child who expected to find what he was looking for, and he knew that what the boy was looking for on Saturday mornings had come to include him. He knew that Nia's hand had found his under a table in a park without being asked. He knew that she had been carrying the ring. He went inside. He set the ring on the small table by the window, where he would see it in the morning and the morning after, and every morning that followed, not as a conclusion but as a direction. The way certain things function when they have been earned rather than assumed, not an answer, but the best possible question, kept somewhere visible, asked again every day. Outside, Greyhaven settled into the kind of night it specialized in, quiet without emptiness, dark without threat. The water making its permanent argument somewhere, beyond the rooftops, while the houses held their lights and their people and their ordinary irreplaceable weight. Darius Vane, who had once commanded a city and had lost the only thing the city couldn't provide, sat in a small rented house 6 streets from the people he had come to find, and he did not reach for anything, and he did not manage anything, and he did not plan the next move. He simply stayed, and the staying, quiet and unglamorous, and without an audience, was the bravest thing he had ever done.